Welcome back. Today, we're diving straight into the very foundation of one of the most famous legends in human history. We're looking directly at Plato's dialogue, the Critias, written way back around 360 BC. In this explainer, we're not doing a modern fantasy retelling. No, we're exploring the exact original source material that birthed the Atlantis myth to see exactly how Plato constructed this world, detail by detail.
Okay, let's dive into this. When you hear Atlantis, you probably picture Hollywood movies, submarines, maybe some glowing magic crystals. But if we want to know what the original 360 BC story actually said, we've got to throw all of that right out the window. What we find in Plato's text is something entirely different. It's a highly structured, mathematically precise description of a geopolitical superpower. You see, to Plato's audience, this wasn't just a fairy tale. It was framed as a historical account of a very real, very dangerous empire.
Section 1. The 9,000-Year War, an ancient global conflict.
To really understand Atlantis, we have to start with this exact number, 9,000. Plato frames this whole narrative around an epic ancient conflict, telling us that 9,000 years had already passed since a massive global war took place. On one side, you had the ancient city of Athens leading the free world, and on the other, this overwhelming, expansionist force commanded by the kings of Atlantis, who lived way out past the Pillars of Hercules.
And the sheer scale he describes is just absolutely absurd. He's talking about an island empire greater in extent than Libya and Asia combined. We're talking about a landmass of literal continental proportions here. Now, the text wastes zero time telling us how this all ends. This massive continent was swallowed by an earthquake, turning into an impassable barrier of mud that blocked all ocean travel. But before we get stuck in the mud, we need to rewind and look at its divine origins.
According to the source, this whole thing kicked off with Poseidon, the Greek god of the sea. He was allotted this territory, and he ended up falling in love with a mortal woman named Cleito. Now keep that in your back pocket. This island is born from a mortal admixture, a literal blending of god and human, which becomes super important later on. To protect his mortal bride, Poseidon broke the ground and literally carved the center island into perfect alternating rings of sea and land. The text actually says he turned them as with a lathe, making them perfectly equidistant. Then he summoned two springs from the earth, one warm, one cold, setting up this absolute paradise.
Section 2. Marvels of Ancient Engineering.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how we move from divine creation right into the absolute peak of their golden age. Poseidon and Cleito had 10 sons, and the eldest, Atlas, became the first king. His wealth triggered a massive construction boom, fueled by a very specific, mythical material, orichalcum. According to Plato, the Atlanteans dug this stuff out of the earth in massive quantities. It was a metal that flashed with a red light, and back then it was second in value only to gold. This gleaming red metal completely defined the over-the-top, opulent aesthetic of Atlantean architecture.
But they didn't just have shiny metals. The island provided absolutely everything required for life and staggering luxury. They were completely self-sufficient. We're talking abundant timber, fragrant roots distilling from flowers, endless fruits, and wild animals. Plato even makes a point to note that the island supported a huge population of elephants, the largest and most voracious of all animals, which really just highlights the extreme, almost impossible natural abundance of their empire.
And they used all these resources to build a visually stunning metropolis. They quarried stone right out from underneath the island, and get a load of the colors, white, black, and red stone. They built these massive concentric walls around their city zones, and then coated those walls in metal. The outer wall was coated in brass, the inner wall in tin, and that innermost wall surrounding the citadel, that one flashed with the red light of orichalcum. The sensory contrast of this colorful stonework, right alongside those gleaming metallic walls, must have been blindingly beautiful.
But it gets even crazier when we look at what was actually inside the citadel. Right at the very center was a holy, inaccessible temple dedicated to Poseidon. The aesthetic here is probably best described as barbaric opulence. The roof was made of solid ivory, curiously wrought with gold, silver, and orichalcum. And dominating the room was this massive solid gold statue of Poseidon standing in a chariot driving 6 winged horses. The statue was so impossibly huge that Poseidon's head actually touched the roof of the temple. This was the overwhelming, unmatched riches of the 10 princes on full glorious display.
Outside the city walls, the engineering was just as insane. Look at this number, 10,000. Plato writes that the central city sat on a vast rectangular plain. To control the water coming down from the mountains, they dug an artificial ditch entirely surrounding this plain. This ditch was 100 feet deep and an incredible 10,000 stadia in length. Even the text admits that a work of such extent seems totally incredible for human hands, but it insists it was meticulously excavated to perfectly irrigate their crops twice a year.
Section 3. The absurd military scale. Defending the empire.
And this brilliantly illustrates that when you have an empire this rich, you absolutely have to defend it. And Plato's blueprint is mathematically precise about how they did it. He gives us the exact logistical breakdown. That massive plain was divided into 60,000 military lots. Each lot was legally required to furnish specific fractions of a fighting force. This resulted in a staggering standing army boasting 10,000 war chariots, a fleet of 1,200 ships, plus countless heavy-armed soldiers, slingers, and javelin men. This wasn't just a guard, this was a highly organized, lethal military machine.
Section 4. Laws written in blood. Ancient rituals. So how exactly did the kings maintain order over such a massive, lethal population? Well, the 10 kings operated under a system of absolute control, and they were bound to each other through strict mutual pledges. None of this was arbitrary either. It was all dictated by the ancient laws of their divine father, Poseidon. These laws were physically inscribed on a sacred orichalcum pillar sitting directly in the middle of the island. Every 5th or 6th year, the 10 kings would gather at this pillar to pass judgment on one another.
I want you to picture this wildly intense ritual. The 10 kings are left completely alone in the temple grounds, where wild bulls are just roaming free. They have to hunt a bull without any iron weapons, using only wooden staves and nooses. Once they catch it, they lead it over to the orichalcum pillar and slit its throat so the blood pours directly over those sacred inscriptions. Then they take a clot of the bull's blood, mix it into a massive bowl of wine, drink it, and swear terrible oaths, invoking mighty curses on anyone who disobeys. Finally, dressed in these beautiful azure robes, they sit in the pitch dark over the glowing embers of the sacrifice to pass judgment on one another. I mean, it is incredibly cinematic and visceral.
The ritual concludes at daybreak. After this dark primal night of blood sacrifice and glowing embers, they basically transition right into meticulous legal bureaucrats. They write down their official sentences on a golden tablet and dedicate it as a permanent memorial. It's this bizarre, fascinating mix of brutal ancient magic and highly documented legal justice that governed their entire society.
Section 5. The fate of divine virtue. The fall of Atlantis.
So, the crucial point is, with all this wealth, this unmatched military, and these strict divine laws, how did they end up as a giant barrier of mud? Well, it all comes down to the fade of divine virtue. For many generations, the Atlanteans possessed a divine nature. They were gentle, wise, and sober. In fact, Plato tells us they originally despised their own gold, viewing their massive wealth as a burden. But remember that mortal admixture from the very beginning? Over time, as generations intermarried, the divine portion faded away, and human nature got the upper hand. They became entirely unable to bear their own good fortune, growing full of avarice, unseemly, and violently addicted to unrighteous power.
And Plato offers one of the most brilliant psychological insights in his entire text right here. He notes that as their souls rotted from the inside out, they maintained their magnificent outward appearance. To those with no eye to see true happiness, meaning people who only value material wealth and power, the Atlanteans appeared the most glorious and blessed exactly at the moment when they were the most spiritually debased and corrupt. Their outward wealth completely masked their inner decay.
Section 6. Zeus passes his judgment. Ultimate punishment.
This unchecked corruption sets the stage for the dramatic climax. The god of gods, Zeus, observes this honorable race falling into a woeful plight and decides to inflict a punishment to chasten and improve them. Plato builds massive, cinematic tension right at the very end of his dialogue, writing, Zeus collected all the gods into their most holy habitation, which being placed in the center of the world beholds all created things. And when he had them together, he spake as follows. Zeus is literally standing at the center of the universe, addressing the divine council, preparing to pass the ultimate judgment.
And that is exactly where the original 360 BC text cuts off. Literally, Plato never finished the sentence. He stops right there, mid-thought. It is arguably the greatest cliffhanger in literary history. We know from the very beginning of the story that Atlantis ultimately sinks into an impassable barrier of mud, but we never get to hear the actual words of Zeus or read Plato's description of the cataclysm itself. So based on the incredible wealth, the massive military, and the dark blood rituals we've just explored in this explainer, what horrific punishment do you think Zeus unleashed to wipe this empire off the face of the earth? It's something to think about until next time.